This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I still remember that camping trip like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a year now. My family and I had been planning it for months, a week-long adventure in Yellowstone National Park. We were all so excited, especially my kids. They couldn't stop talking about seeing Old Faithful and spotting wildlife. If only we had known what was really waiting for us in those woods. We arrived at the campground on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in late August. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze rustling through the pines. As we set up our tents and unpacked the car, I remember feeling so at peace. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and wildflowers. Birds were chirping all around us. It seemed like the ideal spot for a relaxing family getaway. That first evening was lovely. We grilled hot dogs and s'mores over the campfire, telling stories and laughing together under the stars. The kids were thrilled to be sleeping in tents. As I zipped them into their sleeping bags that night, their eyes were shining with excitement for the week ahead. If only I had known it would be our last moment of true peace and happiness on that trip. The next morning, we decided to go for a short hike on one of the nearby trails. It was supposed to be an easy 2-mile loop, perfect for the kids. About halfway through, we came across another campsite just off the main trail. At first glance, it looked normal enough. A couple of tents, some camping chairs, a fire pit. But as we got closer, I started to feel uneasy. The tents were unzipped and wide open, with sleeping bags and clothes strewn all over. The fire pit was cold, with half-burned logs laying haphazardly. An overturned cooler lay on its side, its contents spilled across the ground. It looked like whoever had been camping there had left in a huge hurry. Maybe they just packed up quickly to go on a hike, my wife Sarah suggested, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. I peered into one of the tents and felt my stomach drop. There were deep gouges in the tent fabric, like someone or something had slashed at it with claws or a knife. A torn backpack lay inside, its contents scattered. I saw a smartphone with a cracked screen laying face down in the dirt. "Kids, stay close," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think we should head back now." As we turned to leave, my son pointed to something on the ground near the fire pit. "Dad, what's that?" I walked over and felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a massive paw print, easily twice the size of my hand. Whatever had made it was no ordinary forest creature. We quickened our pace as we headed back down the trail, the kids picking up on our anxiety and asking rapid-fire questions. I tried to reassure them, but my mind was racing. What the hell had happened at that campsite? Should we report it to the rangers? Lost in thought, I almost tripped over the man lying in the middle of the trail. He came out of nowhere. One second the path was clear, the next this guy was sprawled at our feet. He looked to be in his 40s, with wild eyes and clothes that were filthy and torn. His skin was covered in scratches and bruises. "Help me," he wheezed, grabbing at my leg. "It's still out there. We have to get away." My wife screamed and pulled the kids back. I knelt down, torn between wanting to help this clearly traumatized man and needing to protect my family. "Sir, what happened? Are you hurt? We can call for help." But he just kept babbling, his eyes darting frantically around the forest. No time. It'll find us. Have to keep moving. Never should have come here. This forest, it's not right. Things in the trees. Watching. Always watching." He struggled to his feet, swaying unsteadily. Before I could stop him, he lurched off into the underbrush, still muttering to himself. Within seconds, he had vanished from sight. We stood there in shocked silence for a moment. Then my daughter started crying, and my son asked in a small voice, "Daddy, what's going on?" I wished I had an answer for him. All I knew was that we needed to get back to our campsite immediately. We practically ran the rest of the way, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle in the bushes. Back at our tent, I tried calling the ranger station to report what we'd seen, but there was no cell service. The comm board by the bathrooms said the rangers wouldn't be back until tomorrow morning. We were on our own. As the day wore on, an oppressive silence seemed to settle over the forest. The birdsong and chattering squirrels from yesterday were gone. Even the wind had died down, leaving the trees eerily still. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was never anything there. Just shadows and leaves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My wife suggested we pack up and leave early, but I was worried about driving these twisting mountain roads after dark. We decided to stick it out one more night and leave at first light. I don't think any of us slept more than a few minutes that night. Every snapping twig or flutter of wind made us bolt upright in our sleeping bags. Just before dawn, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Primal, ancient, hungry. We were in the car within minutes, leaving half our gear behind in our haste to get away. As I peeled out of the campground, I could have sworn I saw a massive, shadowy shape move between the trees. But it was gone in a blink, and I told myself it was just my exhausted, terrified mind playing tricks. To this day, I don't know what really happened in those woods. We never went camping again. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a series of weird coincidences mixed with an overactive imagination. But then I remember that gut-deep feeling of wrongness, of being prey in our own forests. And I know that something was out there. Something old and patient and alien to our world. I just pray it stays in those remote forests, far from civilization. Because if it ever decided to come looking for us, God help us all. I was always confident in my wilderness skills. Years of training and countless solo treks had honed my abilities to navigate even the most challenging terrain. So when I set out on a week-long solo expedition, deep into the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest, I felt fully prepared for whatever nature might throw at me. The first couple of days went smoothly. I hiked through dense pine forests, forded icy streams, and set up camp each night under a canopy of stars. The solitude was exhilarating. Out here, it was just me and the wilderness. On the third day, I ventured into a particularly remote area, further from any trails or signs of civilization than I'd ever been before. The forest seemed to grow denser and darker with each mile. An unsettling quiet settled over the woods. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals, just an oppressive silence. As dusk approached, I started looking for a suitable campsite. That's when I saw it, a crude lean-to shelter nestled between two massive Douglas firs. My first thought was that another hiker must have built it, but as I got closer, I realized this was no ordinary camp. The shelter was made of branches woven together in an intricate pattern I'd never seen before. Strands of what looked like human hair were tied around some of the branches. A chill ran down my spine. Who would build something like this out here? And why use hair? I told myself it was probably just some eccentric hermit living off the grid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to move on and find somewhere else to camp for the night. As I hiked away from the shelter, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I whirled around, scanning the deepening shadows between the trees, but saw nothing. I quickened my pace, wanting to put as much distance between myself and that unnerving shelter as possible before nightfall. Just as the last bit of daylight was fading, I found a small clearing and hurriedly set up my tent. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me bolt upright, straining to hear in the darkness. Several times, I could have sworn I heard the soft crunch of footsteps circling my tent, but when I shone my flashlight outside, there was never anything there. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I breathed a sigh of relief. I'd made it through the night. Exhausted from lack of sleep but eager to get moving, I quickly broke camp and set off. The day started off uneventfully enough. I hiked for several hours, following my planned route deeper into the wilderness. But as the morning wore on, that prickling sensation of being watched returned stronger than ever. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the forest behind me appeared empty. Around midday, I stopped in a small glade to check my map and eat some trail mix. That's when I saw them, a set of bare footprints in a patch of mud about 20 feet away. They were unnaturally large and deep, as if made by someone or something incredibly heavy, and they were fresh. My heart began to race. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see some hulking figure emerge from the shadows, but there was nothing. Just those unsettling footprints as a sign that I wasn't alone out here. I hastily repacked my gear, my hands shaking slightly. Part of me wanted to turn back, to get out of these godforsaken woods as quickly as possible. But I knew the quickest way out was to press on to my planned exit point. I just needed to stay calm and keep moving. As I continued hiking, adrenaline coursing through my veins, I became hyper-aware of every sound and movement around me. The forest seemed to have come alive with malevolent energy. Branches swayed menacingly in a wind I couldn't feel. Shadows danced at the corner of my vision. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, but not human either. It raised the hairs on my arms and sent ice water through my veins. I broke into a run, no longer caring about stealth or conserving energy. Pure survival instinct took over as I crashed through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face and roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I kept going. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, heavy footfalls and that terrifying growl. Whatever was chasing me was fast, much faster than any human could be. In desperation, I veered off my planned route, hoping to lose it in the tangled forest. For what felt like hours, I ran in a blind panic. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Eventually, I burst out of the tree line onto a logging road. I nearly wept with relief at this sign of civilization. I staggered down the road, constantly looking over my shoulder, but whatever had been chasing me seemed to have given up once I left the deep forest. As my adrenaline faded, exhaustion took over. I collapsed on the side of the road, gulping in huge breaths of air. A few hours later, a logging truck came by and gave me a ride to the nearest town. I was a mess, clothes torn, covered in cuts and bruises, wild-eyed with fear. The driver kept giving me concerned looks, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. Who would believe me? It's been months since that harrowing experience, but I still have nightmares about those woods. The unseen presence stalking me, those inhuman footprints, that bone-chilling growl. I've gone over it again and again in my mind, trying to rationalize what happened. But deep down, I know I encountered something in that forest that defies explanation. Something ancient and malevolent that doesn't want humans encroaching on its domain. I've given up solo trekking. Hell, I can barely bring myself to go camping in my backyard these days. Those remote wilds I once loved now fill me with dread. Whatever's out there in the deepest parts of the wilderness, I hope to God I never encounter it again. I've been an avid mountain climber for over a decade, always seeking out the next big challenge. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on Mount Everest last year. It still haunts me to this day. I'd been planning the Everest expedition for months, meticulously going over every detail. As an experienced climber, I knew the risks, but I felt ready. The ascent started off well, challenging but manageable. The weather was clear as I made my way up, stopping at the various camps. Finally, after days of climbing, I reached the summit. The view was breathtaking, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I felt on top of the world, literally, but my elation was short-lived. Within minutes, the weather shifted dramatically. Dark clouds rolled in and visibility dropped to near zero as a vicious storm engulfed the mountain. I knew I had to descend quickly before conditions worsened, but in the whiteout, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The wind howled, pelting me with ice and snow. I carefully made my way down, relying on my experience and muscle memory. That's when things got truly terrifying. Through the swirling snow, I caught glimpses of a massive, shadowy figure moving nearby. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. This was no ordinary storm. I picked up my pace, heart pounding. Whatever was out there, it was hunting me. I could sense its presence, always just out of sight. The growling got closer. At one point, I saw massive footprints in the snow, bigger than any human or known animal. Panic set in as I realized I was being stalked by something not of this world. My training went out the window as raw survival instinct took over. I practically flew down the mountain, no longer caring about proper technique. My only thought was escape. The creature pursued relentlessly. Massive fur-covered arms would emerge from the white void, swiping at me. Rows of razor-sharp teeth gleamed in the darkness. I caught flashes of red eyes watching me. My gear was torn, and I was bleeding from several cuts, but adrenaline kept me going. At one point, I lost my footing on some ice and started sliding uncontrollably down a steep section. I thought for sure this was the end, but somehow I managed to dig my ice axe in and stop my fall, mere feet from a sheer cliff edge. The thing's roar of frustration echoed off the mountain walls. I have no idea how long this nightmarish chase lasted. Time lost all meaning as I fought my way down through the blizzard, the monster always right behind me. My lungs burned and my muscles screamed in protest, but stopping meant certain death. Finally, I reached the lower camps where other climbers were waiting out the storm. As soon as I stumbled into view, barely conscious, they pulled me into a tent. I tried to warn them about the creature, but exhaustion overcame me and I passed out. When I came to, the storm had cleared. There was no sign of any monstrous snow beast. The other climbers said they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, just the typical storm sounds. They assumed I was delirious from altitude sickness and exposure. But I know what I experienced was real. The claw marks on my gear and the wounds on my body weren't imaginary. Something inhuman hunted me on that mountain. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe some unknown species of polar bear or ape. But deep down, I know it was something far stranger, something that defies explanation. I thought about mounting another expedition to search for evidence. But honestly, I'm too afraid to ever go back. That thing is still up there, waiting in the ice and snow. I've given up climbing altogether. My nerves can't handle it anymore. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I'm back on that mountain with red eyes watching me from the darkness. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But I'm sharing this as a warning to other climbers. There are things in this world beyond our understanding. If you hear strange sounds or see unexplained shadows while climbing, don't hesitate. Get off that mountain as fast as you can. Your life may depend on it. The memory of that day still chills me to the bone. I used to see mountains as an exciting challenge to be conquered. Now I see them as alien, hostile environments where ancient terrors lurk, waiting for unwary explorers to stumble into their domain. Be careful out there, and always trust your instincts. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. We arrived at the campsite on Friday afternoon, spirits high as we set up our tents and got a fire going. The weather was perfect, warm and clear with a light breeze rustling through the trees. We spent that first evening laughing around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories late into the night. Everything seemed so peaceful and idyllic. If only I'd known it was the calm before the storm. The next morning, we woke up early to go on a hike deeper into the forest. In hindsight, I wish we'd just stayed at the campsite. But we were eager to explore, so we packed some snacks and water and set off on one of the trails. At first, it was beautiful. Towering pines, bird song, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. We hiked for a few hours, marveling at the scenery and wildlife. It was around noon when we first noticed something was off. The air felt different, heavier, almost oppressive, and it was eerily quiet, like all the animals had suddenly gone silent. That's when we smelled the smoke, faint at first, but growing stronger by the minute. "Guys, I think there might be a fire nearby," Jenny said, her voice tight with worry. We all exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's head back to camp," Mike suggested. "We can pack up our stuff and get out of here if needed." We turned around and started quickly making our way back down the trail, but it soon became clear that the fire was spreading rapidly. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to see and breathe. Ash started raining down around us. I could feel panic rising in my chest as the realization hit. We were in serious danger. We picked up the pace, practically running now. The sound of crackling flames grew louder, and I could feel the temperature rising. Through gaps in the trees, I caught glimpses of orange flames licking up tree trunks. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Look!" Tom suddenly shouted, pointing ahead. "I see the clearing where we camped." Relief flooded through me for a split second, until I saw the state of our campsite. The fire had already reached it. Our tents were ablaze, along with all our supplies. We skidded to a halt, staring in horror. "Oh God, what do we do now?" Jenny cried, her voice shaking. Mike took charge. "We need to keep moving. Head downhill towards the river. It's our best chance." We took off running again, stumbling over roots and rocks in our haste. The smoke was so thick now I could barely see a few feet in front of me. My lungs burned with every breath. Sweat poured down my face, mingling with tears of fear and desperation. That's when I saw it. A dark shape moving through the smoke. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, my panicked mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw another, and another. Shadowy figures darting between the burning trees, always just at the edge of my vision. "Guys," I gasped out between ragged breaths, "I think there's something out there, following us." "What are you talking about?" Tom yelled back. "Look, in the smoke," I pointed frantically. We all slowed for a moment, peering into the hazy inferno around us. A chill ran down my spine as I saw understanding and fear dawn on my friends' faces. They saw them too. "What the hell are those things?" Mike whispered. "I don't know, and I don't want to find out," Jenny replied. "Keep moving." We ran faster than I thought possible, spurred on by sheer terror. The shadowy figures kept pace, always staying just out of clear sight. I caught glimpses of unnaturally long limbs, of gleaming eyes reflecting the flames. They moved with an inhuman grace through the burning forest, unaffected by the heat and smoke that was slowly killing us. Hours blurred together as we fled through that hellscape. The forest became a maze of fire and smoke, trees crashing down around us. Several times we had to backtrack or change course to avoid walls of flame. All the while, those things pursued us relentlessly. My legs felt like lead, my throat raw from the smoke. I was disoriented, unsure which direction we were even running anymore. Part of me wanted to just give up, to collapse and let the fire or those creatures take me. But some primal survival instinct kept me going. As night fell, the forest became even more terrifying. The fire cast everything in a hellish orange glow. Sparks and embers swirled through the air like demon fireflies, and those shadow creatures seemed to grow bolder in the dark, drawing ever closer. We huddled together at the base of a large boulder, trying to catch our breath and get our bearings. That's when we heard it, a low, rattling growl that made my blood run cold. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "Oh God," Jenny whimpered. "They're getting closer." I peered around the edge of the boulder and immediately wished I hadn't. There, not 20 feet away, stood one of our pursuers. In the firelight, I could finally see it clearly. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but far too tall and thin to be human. Its limbs were impossibly long and jointed in all the wrong places. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Just empty, smooth skin where features should be, with two glowing pinpricks of light where eyes should be. I jerked back, biting down on my hand to keep from screaming. Tears streamed down my ash-covered face as I looked at my friends. Their expressions mirrored the terror I felt. We were going to die here, I realized. Burned alive or torn apart by these monsters. Those were our only options now. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, we heard a new sound. A steady thump, thump, thump that seemed to come from above. At first I thought it was just my own frantic heartbeat. But then a beam of light cut through the smoke. "Helicopters!" Mike shouted, pointing up. "Search and rescue!" New energy surged through my exhausted body. We leapt up, waving our arms and screaming at the top of our lungs. The beam of light swept over us, then locked on. I've never felt such overwhelming relief in my life. The next few minutes were a blur. Firefighters in protective gear rappelled down from the helicopter, quickly assessing our condition and getting us fitted with oxygen masks. As they prepared to lift us to safety, I caught one last glimpse of those shadow creatures. They stood at the edge of the clearing, still as statues, those pinprick eyes fixed on us. Then we were rising up through the smoke, leaving the burning nightmare behind. We spent the next week in the hospital recovering from smoke inhalation and minor burns. The authorities questioned us extensively about how we'd survived out there for so long. We told them about getting lost, about the terrifying hours fleeing the flames. But we never mentioned those things that hunted us. Who would believe us? It's been months now, and I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the echo of that rattling growl in my ears. I don't know what those creatures were or why they pursued us. Some kind of predator adapted to forest fires, spirits or demons unleashed by the inferno. I'll probably never know for sure. All I know is that camping trip changed me forever. I gained a new appreciation for life that day, but also a bone-deep fear of what might be lurking in the darkest parts of this world, waiting for disaster to strike so it can emerge from the shadows. The mine was about an hour's drive outside of town, deep in the mountains. As we pulled up to the entrance in Jake's beat-up Jeep, I felt a chill run down my spine. The gaping black maw of the mine shaft loomed before us, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. Rusty old equipment and debris were scattered around, slowly being reclaimed by nature. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily said as we grabbed our backpacks and headlamps. "Don't be such a baby," Tom teased. "It'll be an adventure." If only we'd known then just how right Emily's instincts were. We switched on our headlamps and entered the mine, our beams of light cutting through the inky darkness. The air was damp and musty, with a metallic tang that made me wrinkle my nose. Our footsteps echoed off the rock walls as we ventured deeper. About 15 minutes in, we came across an old personnel cart on a rusted track. "Sweet, let's see if we can get this thing moving," Jake exclaimed. He and Tom started pushing it, the wheels squealing in protest. Suddenly, there was an ear-splitting screech of metal on metal, and the cart jerked forward violently. Jake stumbled and fell, crying out in pain. "Shit, my ankle!" We rushed to help him up. His ankle was already swelling badly, clearly a bad sprain or maybe even a break. "We should head back," Melissa said worriedly. But Jake insisted he could keep going if we just gave him a few minutes to rest. Like idiots, we listened to him. That decision would haunt me for years to come. We pressed on, moving slower now with Jake limping along. The tunnels seemed to stretch endlessly, branching off in different directions. I started to get an uneasy feeling that we were going deeper than we should. That's when we stumbled upon the old mining office. It was a small wooden structure built right into the cave wall. The door creaked open ominously as we entered. Inside, everything was coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Old equipment and paperwork were strewn about. But what caught my eye was a stack of yellowed newspapers on a rickety desk. I picked one up, brushing off the grime. The bold headline made my blood run cold. Tragedy strikes local mine, 37 dead in cave-in. My hands shaking, I read further. The article detailed a horrific accident that had occurred in this very mine decades ago. A massive cave-in had trapped dozens of miners, and rescue efforts had been hampered by unstable conditions. In the end, 37 men lost their lives, their bodies never recovered. "Guys, you need to see this," I said, my voice trembling. As the others crowded around to read, an eerie stillness settled over us. The air suddenly felt thick and oppressive. That's when we heard it, a faint whispering sound echoing from deeper in the mine. We all froze, straining to listen. "Hello? Is someone there?" Tom called out. No response, just more whispers. It almost sounded like muffled voices, but that was impossible. "It's just the wind," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. We all jumped as a loud bang echoed through the tunnels. It sounded like metal hitting rock, like someone was working deeper in the mine. "Okay, this is getting way too creepy," Emily said. "We need to get out of here now." We all agreed and started heading back the way we came. But in our panicked state, we must have taken a wrong turn. The tunnels all looked the same in the dim light of our headlamps. After what felt like hours of wandering, the horrifying realization set in. We were lost. That's when things went from bad to nightmarish. A low rumble started reverberating through the mine. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then small pebbles started raining down from the ceiling. "Cave in!" Tom yelled. "Run!" We took off running blindly through the tunnels as the rumbling grew louder. Rocks and debris were falling all around us. The sound was deafening, a roar of shifting earth and shattering stone. I don't know how long we ran or how we found our way. It's all a blur of terror and adrenaline. Somehow, miraculously, we stumbled out of the mine entrance just as a massive cloud of dust erupted behind us. We collapsed on the ground outside, coughing and gasping for air. When the dust settled, we saw that the mine entrance had completely caved in. If we'd been a minute slower. We sat there in shocked silence for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. It felt surreal, like a nightmare we'd wake up from at any moment. But it wasn't a dream. We'd barely escaped with our lives from that cursed mine. To this day, I'm haunted by what we experienced down there. The whispers, the inexplicable noises, the cave-in that seemed to come out of nowhere. Was it just a coincidence? Or had we awakened something dark and angry in those tunnels? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know one thing. I'll never set foot in another abandoned mine as long as I live. Some places are meant to stay buried, their secrets left undisturbed in the darkness. We were lucky to make it out alive. Others weren't so fortunate. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those whispers echoing in my mind, and I wonder about those 37 souls lost in the depths of that mountain, never to see the light of day again. Do they still wander those collapsed tunnels, trying to find their way home? I shudder at the thought. All I know is that our reckless adventure awakened something that should have been left alone, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to forget the horrors we encountered in that abandoned mine of nightmares. We arrived at the campsite on a sunny Friday afternoon, the air thick with excitement and the scent of pine. There were 5 of us, myself, Jake, Emma, Mike, and Lisa. We quickly set up our tents and got a fire going, laughing and joking as we roasted marshmallows and shared stories under the starry sky. The first sign that something was amiss came in the early hours of Saturday morning. I was jolted awake by the sound of distant gunshots. At first, I thought I might have been dreaming, but as I lay there in my sleeping bag, I heard it again, a sharp crack echoing through the trees. I nudged Jake awake, and we both listened intently. The forest had gone eerily quiet, save for the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. We decided to wake the others and discuss what to do. As we huddled around the smoldering remains of our campfire, the gunshots rang out again, closer this time. Emma, always the voice of reason, suggested we pack up and leave. But something inside me couldn't bear the thought of abandoning the forest and its creatures to whatever danger lurked in the shadows. We agreed to investigate, arming ourselves with whatever we could find: hiking poles, large branches, and a small hatchet we'd brought for firewood. With hearts pounding, we set off in the direction of the gunshots. As we crept through the underbrush, the acrid smell of gunpowder grew stronger. Suddenly, Mike grabbed my arm and pointed. Through a clearing, we saw them. A group of men dressed in camouflage, rifles slung over their shoulders. They were standing over the lifeless body of a magnificent elk, its antlers still proud even in death. The sight made my blood boil. This was a protected area, and hunting was strictly prohibited. These weren't hunters, they were poachers, and they were slaughtering endangered wildlife for profit. We watched in horror as they began to saw off the elk's antlers. That's when Lisa accidentally stepped on a dry branch, the crack echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. The poachers whirled around, their eyes wild with surprise and anger. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other across the clearing. Then, all hell broke loose. One of the men raised his rifle, and I reacted on pure instinct. I hurled my hiking pole like a javelin, catching him in the chest and knocking him off balance. Jake charged forward with a roar, swinging his branch like a baseball bat. The forest erupted into chaos. Gunshots rang out, splintering trees and sending birds scattering into the sky. I saw Mike go down, clutching his leg, and rage surged through me. I tackled the nearest poacher, wrestling his rifle away and tossing it into the underbrush. Emma and Lisa were incredible, working together to trip and disarm another poacher. I'll never forget the look of fierce determination on Emma's face as she swung her hatchet, embedding it deep in a tree trunk inches from a poacher's head. The man's eyes went wide with fear, and he turned tail and ran. The fight seemed to last an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. Outnumbered and taken by surprise, the poachers eventually retreated, leaving behind their grisly trophies and wounded pride. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Mike's leg was bleeding badly from a grazing bullet wound, and we were all covered in cuts and bruises. The once peaceful forest now felt alien and threatening. We quickly gathered our belongings and helped Mike back to our campsite. As we hurriedly packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sent shivers down my spine. The hike back to our cars was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We drove straight to the nearest ranger station to report what had happened. The rangers were shocked and grateful for our information, promising to increase patrols and investigate thoroughly. As we sat in the emergency room waiting for Mike to get patched up, the weight of our experience truly hit me. We had gone into those woods as carefree friends looking for a fun weekend. We emerged as battle-worn survivors, bonded by a shared trauma that would link us forever. In the weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at every loud noise, my dreams haunted by the sound of gunshots and the lifeless eyes of that majestic elk. But alongside the fear and anxiety, I felt something else growing within me, a fierce determination to protect the wilderness and its inhabitants. Our camping trip may have turned into a nightmare, but it also awakened something in each of us. We became passionate advocates for wildlife conservation, using our story to raise awareness about the devastating impact of poaching. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself listening for those gunshots in the distance. But now, instead of fear, I feel a sense of purpose. We may have left the forest that day, but a part of it, and the fight to protect it, will always remain with us. The experience changed us in ways we're still discovering. We went into those woods as naive campers and came out as reluctant warriors. The scars we bear, both physical and emotional, serve as a constant reminder of the day we stood up against cruelty and chose to fight for something greater than ourselves. As I sit here typing this, I can't help but wonder about those poachers. Did they give up their illegal activities, or are they still out there, threatening the delicate balance of nature? One thing's for certain, if I ever hear those gunshots again, I won't hesitate to stand up and fight. Because now I know that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we never expected to face. Still remember that day like it was yesterday. The crisp mountain air, the excitement of a new photography expedition, and the eerie silence that seemed to blanket the entire forest. I'd been planning this solo trip for months, eager to capture the raw beauty of the wilderness without any distractions. As I hiked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The birds weren't singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But I brushed it off, chalking it up to pre-shoot jitters. I'd been doing this for years, after all. What could possibly go wrong? I set up my first shot near a babbling brook, framing the perfect composition of water, rocks, and towering pines. As I clicked away, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was probably just the cool mist from the water, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Moving on to my next location, I found a clearing with an old, gnarled tree that practically begged to be photographed. As I adjusted my lens, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing but shadows and leaves. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." I continued shooting throughout the day, each location more breathtaking than the last. But with each click of the shutter, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. It was as if invisible eyes were boring into the back of my skull, watching my every move. As the sun began to set, I decided to call it a day and head back to my campsite. I couldn't wait to review the shots I'd taken, hoping they'd be some of my best work yet. Little did I know, I was about to discover something that would change my life forever. Back at camp, I pulled out my laptop and began transferring the images. As they loaded onto the screen, my blood ran cold. In the background of nearly every photo, partially hidden by trees or rocks, were dark, shadowy figures. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light or a smudge on my lens. But as I zoomed in, I realized with growing horror that these were no optical illusions. The figures were humanoid in shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. And their eyes, God, their eyes. Even in the grainy images, I could see them glowing with an otherworldly light. My hands shook as I flipped through photo after photo. In some, the figures were barely visible, just a hint of darkness at the edge of the frame. In others, they were bold enough to stand in plain sight, as if daring me to notice them. And the most terrifying part? In each successive image, they seemed to be getting closer. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out of the tent, sweeping the beam across the campsite. The woods were pitch black now, and every shadow seemed to move and writhe with a life of its own. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" Silence, but not the peaceful silence of nature. This was a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow up my words. And then, just at the edge of my hearing, I heard it. A soft, rattling breath that didn't sound human at all. I didn't even bother packing up my gear. I grabbed my car keys and ran, crashing through the underbrush like a madman. Branches whipped at my face, and roots seemed to reach up to trip me. But I didn't slow down. I could feel them behind me, getting closer with each passing second. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. As I slammed it shut and started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A tall, impossibly thin figure standing at the edge of the tree line, its glowing eyes fixed directly on me. I floored it, tires spitting gravel as I tore out of the parking area. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, and even then I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those glowing eyes in the back seat. It's been weeks since that night, and I still can't bring myself to look at those photos again. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those things were real, and they were watching me the entire time I was in those woods. I've given up nature photography. Hell, I can barely bring myself to step outside my apartment these days, because every time I do, I feel those eyes on me again, watching, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that someday they're going to finish what they started in those woods. I don't know what those things were or why they were following me, but I do know one thing for certain. We are not alone in this world, and some things are better left unphotographed and undiscovered. If you're planning a solo trip into the wilderness, take my advice. Bring a friend, keep your wits about you, and for God's sake, check your photos. You never know what might be lurking in the background, just out of sight. As for me, I'm done with the great outdoors. I'll stick to city skylines and portrait photography from now on. At least in the city, when you feel like you're being watched, it's probably just your paranoid imagination. Out there in the wilderness, it might be something far, far worse. I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes and twisted figures. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that rattling breath just outside my window. And on the darkest nights, when the shadows seem to move on their own, I find myself wondering, did I really escape that night? Or did I just bring something back with me? Something that's been biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I may never know the truth about what happened on that photography expedition. But one thing's for certain. I'll never look at a photograph the same way again, because now I know that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones hiding just beyond the frame, watching and waiting for their moment to step into the light. I was so excited for our annual father-son camping trip. My boy Jake had just turned 12, and I wanted to make some great memories together before he hit those moody teenage years. We packed up the car and headed out early Saturday morning for Whispering Pines State Park, about a 3-hour drive from our home. The weather was perfect as we arrived, sunny and mild, with a light breeze rustling through the trees. We found a nice secluded spot to set up camp, away from the more crowded areas. Jake helped me pitch the tent while I got a fire going. We spent the afternoon hiking some of the nearby trails, identifying different plants and animal tracks. Jake's always been fascinated by nature, constantly peppering me with questions about everything we see. It warms my heart to see his curiosity. As evening approached, we headed back to our campsite to cook dinner. I was in the middle of showing Jake how to properly clean a fish when we heard voices approaching. 2 men in park ranger uniforms emerged from the trees, greeting us with friendly waves. "Evening, folks," the taller one called out. "Just doing our nightly rounds. Mind if we take a quick look at your site?" "Not at all," I replied, gesturing for them to look around. Something felt a bit off, but I brushed it aside. They were rangers after all. The men poked around our campsite, asking standard questions about how long we'd be staying and if we'd seen any wildlife. But their eyes kept darting to our gear, lingering a bit too long on our backpacks and cooler. The shorter ranger seemed particularly interested in my car, peering through the windows. "Everything looks good here," the tall one finally said. "You folks have a nice night. We'll be patrolling the area if you need anything." As they walked away, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Their uniforms looked a bit worn, and I hadn't noticed any ranger vehicles nearby. Plus, I'd never had rangers inspect our site so thoroughly before. I tried to push my paranoia aside as Jake and I finished making dinner. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows over the fire, laughing and swapping stories. But as darkness fell, my unease grew. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those rangers lurking in the shadows. Around 10 p.m., I suggested we turn in for the night. Jake protested at first, wanting to stay up later, but eventually relented. We crawled into our sleeping bags, the soft glow of our lantern casting eerie shadows on the tent walls. I lay awake for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, an owl hooting in the distance, the crackle of our dying fire. I must have dozed off at some point because I was jolted awake by voices outside our tent. Hushed, urgent whispers. My heart began to race as I recognized them. It was those rangers again. What were they doing back here so late? Carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. What I saw made my blood run cold. The two rangers were rifling through our belongings, emptying our backpacks onto the ground. A third man I hadn't seen before was going through my car, the door hanging open. I quickly zipped the tent back up, my mind racing. These weren't real rangers. They were thieves, maybe worse. We were in serious danger. I gently shook Jake awake, putting a finger to my lips to keep him quiet. His eyes widened in fear as I whispered what was happening. "We need to get out of here," I breathed. "When I say go, we're going to run into the woods as quietly as possible. Don't look back, just follow me, okay?" Jake nodded, trembling. I could see the terror in his eyes, mirroring my own. We slipped on our shoes, and I grabbed the small emergency pack I always keep by my sleeping bag. Heart pounding, I counted to 3, then unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. "Go!" I hissed, and we burst out of the tent. The men shouted in surprise, but we were already sprinting for the tree line. Branches whipped at our faces as we plunged into the dark forest, the sound of heavy footsteps and angry voices behind us. I grabbed Jake's hand, pulling him along as we zigzagged between trees. The forest was pitch black, the moon hidden behind clouds. We stumbled over roots and rocks, scratching ourselves on thorny bushes, but the fear of what was behind us kept us moving. "Dad, I'm scared," Jake gasped between breaths. "It's okay, buddy," I panted. "Just keep running, we're going to be all right." But I wasn't sure I believed my own words. I had no idea where we were going or how far behind our pursuers were. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, each tree looking the same as the last in the darkness. After what felt like hours of running, but was probably only 20 minutes, I finally slowed our pace. My lungs were burning and Jake was wheezing beside me. I strained my ears, but couldn't hear anyone following us anymore. We crouched behind a large fallen log, trying to catch our breath. Jake was shaking uncontrollably, whether from fear or the chilly night air, I couldn't tell. I pulled him close, rubbing his arms to warm him up. "What's going to happen to us, Dad?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "We're going to be fine," I assured him, trying to keep the tremor out of my own voice. "We just need to wait here until morning, then we'll find our way back to the ranger station, the real rangers." We huddled there for hours, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. I didn't dare risk using the flashlight in my emergency pack, afraid it might attract attention. Instead, I focused on comforting Jake, telling him stories to distract him from our terrifying situation. As the sky began to lighten, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. We'd made it through the night. Jake had eventually fallen into a fitful sleep against my shoulder, and I gently woke him as dawn broke. "Come on, buddy, let's try to find our way out of here." We started walking, hoping to find a trail or some sign of civilization. After about an hour, we stumbled upon a hiking path. Relief washed over me. This had to lead somewhere. We followed it for another couple of miles before finally hearing voices ahead. Real voices this time, cheerful hikers out for a morning trek. I've never been so happy to see strangers in my life. We must have looked a sight, scratched up, covered in dirt, leaves in our hair. The hikers immediately offered help, sharing their water and granola bars. One of them had a satellite phone and called for assistance. The real park rangers arrived about 30 minutes later. They were shocked by our story and immediately sent out search parties to look for the imposters. They drove us to the ranger station where we gave our official statements. Our campsite had been completely ransacked, all our valuables stolen. But I didn't care about any of that. Jake and I were safe, and that's all that mattered. We never did find out who those men were or why they targeted us. The Rangers increased patrols in the area, but the thieves seemed to have vanished without a trace. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining those footsteps chasing us through the dark woods. Jake and I still go camping, but now we stick to established campgrounds with plenty of other people around. That night changed us both. We're more cautious now, always looking over our shoulders. But it also brought us closer together. We survived something terrifying as a team, and that bond is unbreakable. I often think about how differently things could have turned out if I hadn't trusted my instincts. It's a chilling reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, even in the peaceful wilderness. But it's also a testament to the strength we can find when protecting those we love. That night in the forest, running for our lives, I discovered a courage I never knew I had. And for that, in a strange way, I'm grateful. It started off like any other solo trek. I packed my usual gear: water, trail mix, first aid kit, map and compass. The weather was perfect as I set out early that crisp autumn morning. The trail was well marked and I made good time for the first few hours, enjoying the vibrant fall colors and fresh mountain air. Around midday, I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook. That's when things started to get strange. As I was packing up to continue on, I noticed the sun seemed to be in the wrong position in the sky. I checked my watch and compass, but they both seemed to be malfunctioning. Slightly unnerved but not overly concerned, I pressed on. But with each step, an unsettling feeling grew in the pit of my stomach. The terrain began to look unfamiliar, despite being on a trail I knew well. The trees seemed different somehow, taller and more gnarled. Even the quality of the light filtering through the leaves felt off. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked the same. Panic started to set in as I realized I was completely lost. I pulled out my map, but it might as well have been blank. Nothing matched up with what I was seeing around me. My phone had no signal. As the afternoon wore on, my confusion and fear mounted. How was this possible? I was an expert navigator, intimately familiar with these trails, yet I felt like I had somehow been transported to an alien landscape. Just as despair was about to overwhelm me, I spotted a family up ahead on the trail, a man, woman, and 2 young kids. Relief washed over me as I jogged to catch up with them. "Excuse me," I called out. "I hate to bother you, but I seem to be completely turned around. Can you tell me where exactly we are?" The father gave me a quizzical look. "We're in Glacier National Park, about 2 miles from Logan Pass." I stared at him in disbelief. That's impossible. I started my hike this morning in Georgia. Glacier is over 2,000 miles away." The family exchanged worried glances. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" the mother asked gently. "Do you need medical assistance?" I assured them I was fine, just very confused. They seemed unconvinced, but pointed me in the direction of the nearest ranger station before continuing on their way. My mind reeled as I tried to process this impossible information. How could I have traveled halfway across the country in just a few hours? Was I hallucinating? Having some kind of mental breakdown? Nothing made sense. With no better options, I decided to follow the family's directions to the ranger station. But after walking for what felt like hours, there was still no sign of it. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I needed to find shelter for the night. As darkness fell, the forest took on an eerie quality. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Strange whispers echoed through the trees, just on the edge of comprehension. An overwhelming sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I was about to give up and make camp for the night when I spotted a dim light through the trees. Heart pounding, I made my way towards it. As I drew closer, I realized it was coming from a small cabin. Immense relief flooded through me. Finally, I could get some help and figure out what the hell was going on. I rushed up to the door and knocked frantically. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." The door creaked open, revealing a familiar face. It was the father from the hiking family I'd encountered earlier, but something was off. His eyes seemed glassy and unfocused, his movements oddly stiff. "Welcome, traveler," he intoned in a flat voice. "We've been expecting you." A chill ran down my spine. This was wrong. All wrong. I backed away slowly, mumbling an apology. As I retreated, I caught a glimpse through the doorway of the rest of the family, seated around a table, completely motionless, with the same vacant expressions. I turned and ran blindly into the forest, heart pounding in my ears. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away from that cabin as possible. After what felt like hours of running, I finally collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. As my panic subsided, confusion set in once again. What the hell was happening to me? I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, wan morning light was filtering through the trees. Groaning, I pulled myself to my feet, muscles aching from sleeping on the hard ground. Looking around, I realized I was in yet another unfamiliar landscape. Gone were the towering mountains of glacier. Now I seemed to be in a dense, swampy area. The air was thick with humidity, and I could hear the drone of insects all around. Disoriented and dehydrated, I stumbled forward, hoping to find some source of water. As I pushed through the underbrush, my foot suddenly sank into mud up to my knee. I tried to pull free, but only managed to sink deeper. Quicksand. Panic gripped me as I thrashed, trying desperately to escape the sucking mud. But the more I struggled, the faster I sank. Just as the mud reached my chest, I felt strong hands grip my arms. With a mighty heave, I was pulled free of the muck and dragged onto solid ground. Coughing and spluttering, I looked up to see my rescuers. My blood ran cold. It was the hiking family again. But this time, instead of blank stares, their faces were twisted into grotesque, leering grins. "Careful there, friend," the father said, his voice dripping with malice. "Wouldn't want to lose you just yet. The fun's only just beginning." I scrambled backwards, heart pounding. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up. When I opened them again, the family was gone. I was alone in the swamp once more. The rest of the day passed in a blur of confusion and terror. The landscape seemed to shift around me constantly. One moment I was trudging through a scorching desert. The next, I was knee-deep in snow. Familiar landmarks would appear, only to vanish when I tried to approach them. And always, that damned family would appear, sometimes offering help, sometimes taunting me, sometimes just silently watching from a distance. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. As night fell once again, exhaustion finally overcame me. I collapsed to the ground, no longer caring where I was or what happened to me. I just wanted it to be over. I awoke to the steady beep of a heart monitor. Blinking in the harsh fluorescent light, I realized I was in a hospital bed. A nurse noticed I was awake and quickly called for a doctor. They told me I had been found wandering deliriously along a highway over 500 miles from where I had started my hike. I had severe dehydration and exposure and had been unconscious for days. I tried to explain what had happened to me, but the words sounded crazy even to my own ears. The doctors exchanged concerned looks and gently suggested I speak with a psychiatrist. It's been months now, and I still have no explanation for what occurred during those lost days. Was it all a hallucination brought on by dehydration and exhaustion? Some kind of psychotic break? Or did I truly experience something beyond the bounds of normal reality? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But one thing's for certain, I'll never set foot in the wilderness alone again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The first few days of the hike went smoothly. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies and mild temperatures. I made good progress along the rugged trail, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. By the third day, I had left all signs of civilization behind. I hadn't seen another person in over 24 hours. It was just me. the towering peaks, and the vast wilderness stretching out in every direction. As evening approached on that third day, I started looking for a suitable campsite. I found a small clearing nestled between some large boulders, with a bubbling stream nearby. It seemed like an ideal spot, protected from the wind and with easy access to water. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. After cooking a simple dinner over my camp stove, I sat by the small fire and watched the stars come out. The silence was profound. No sounds of traffic or human activity, just the gentle burbling of the stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was exactly the kind of wilderness solitude I had been seeking. As the fire died down to embers, I crawled into my tent and snuggled into my sleeping bag. Despite the long day of hiking, I found myself lying awake, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a vague sense of unease had settled over me. Just as I was finally starting to drift off to sleep, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the rocky ground outside my tent. My eyes flew open, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling around my campsite. At first I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but the rhythm was all wrong. This was clearly bipedal movement. A bear, maybe? But it was too light and precise for a lumbering bear. The footsteps completed a circuit of my campsite and then paused directly in front of my tent. I lay there rigid with fear, hardly daring to breathe. Whatever was out there was now only inches away from me, separated by just the thin fabric of the tent. I could hear deep, raspy breathing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This was no animal. The breathing sounded disturbingly human-like, but somehow wrong, predatory, malevolent. For what felt like an eternity, the presence remained there, just outside my tent. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or make a sound. My mind raced through possibilities. Another hiker? A deranged murderer? Some kind of cryptid or supernatural entity? None of the explanations I could come up with made any sense. Finally, after what must have been at least 10 minutes but felt like hours, I heard the footsteps slowly move away from my tent. They receded into the distance until I could no longer hear them. But the sense of being watched, of being hunted, remained. I lay there for the rest of the night, wide awake and on high alert. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I clutched my hunting knife tightly, though I knew it would be of little use against whatever was out there. When the first light of dawn finally began to illuminate my tent, I quickly packed up my gear and got the hell out of there. I abandoned my planned route and made a beeline for the nearest trailhead, hiking at a furious pace. It took me 2 exhausting days of nearly non-stop hiking to reach civilization again. In the light of day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, fueled by too many campfire horror stories. Maybe there was a logical explanation that I was overlooking. But deep down, I knew that what I experienced was real. Something had stalked my camp that night, something that didn't belong in this world. The overwhelming sense of malice and wrongness I felt is seared into my memory. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to find similar reports or experiences in that area. While I haven't found anything definitive, there are whispered stories among longtime locals and avid backcountry hikers. Tales of inexplicable noises in the night, of hikers going missing without a trace, of ancient native legends warning of evil spirits in those mountains. Whatever it was, the encounter has changed me profoundly. I used to find peace and joy in the solitude of nature. Now I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, even in broad daylight. I've given up solo backpacking. The thought of spending another night alone in the wilderness fills me with paralyzing dread. I know how crazy this all sounds. If someone had told me a story like this before my trip, I would have dismissed it as an overactive imagination or a campfire tall tale. But I know what I experienced. Something hunted me that night in the mountains, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. So if you're planning a wilderness trek, especially in remote areas, please be careful. Don't go alone if you can avoid it. And if you hear footsteps approaching your tent in the dead of night, well, I hope you never have to experience the terror that I did. I still love the mountains and the outdoors, but now when I look at those majestic peaks and vast forests, I can't help but wonder what secrets and horrors they might be hiding. The wilderness is beautiful, but it can also be a place of unfathomable danger. My experience taught me that there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that are better left undisturbed. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from that night. The sound of those footsteps, the raspy breathing, the overwhelming sense of malevolent presence, it's all seared into my memory. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear those same footsteps circling my house. I've tried therapy, meditation, even medication to deal with the anxiety and PTSD, but nothing seems to fully banish the lingering dread. Part of me wonders if I'll ever feel truly safe again, even in the comfort of my own home. I've become somewhat obsessed with trying to uncover the truth about what happened. I've spent countless hours scouring online forums, old newspapers, and local historical records, looking for any similar accounts or clues. I've reached out to park rangers, wilderness guides, and cryptozoology enthusiasts. While I haven't found any definitive answers, I've uncovered enough to convince me that I'm not alone in my experience. There are other stories out there, hushed accounts of hikers encountering unexplainable phenomena in those same mountains, sightings of shadowy figures that defy explanation, eerie sounds echoing through remote valleys, unsolved disappearances dating back decades. The locals tend to avoid talking about it, but there's a palpable undercurrent of unease when the subject comes up. The indigenous people of the region have legends warning of malevolent spirits and forbidden areas in the high country. Early explorers and trappers wrote in their journals of inexplicable events and a pervasive sense of being watched by unseen eyes. I don't know what to make of it all. I'm not typically prone to belief in the supernatural or paranormal, but I know what I experienced, and I can't simply dismiss it. Whatever was out there that night was real, and it was unlike anything in the natural world. Sometimes I'm tempted to go back, to try to face my fears and uncover the truth. But the thought of entering those mountains again fills me with a primal, paralyzing dread. For now, I'll continue my research from the safety of civilization, hoping to shed light on the dark mystery lurking in the wilderness. If you're heading into the backcountry, especially in remote areas, please be careful. Trust your instincts. And if you experience anything unusual or unsettling, don't hesitate to get out of there. The wilderness can be a place of profound beauty and spiritual renewal, but it can also harbor dangers beyond our comprehension. I used to think I was prepared for anything the backcountry could throw at me. Now I know better. There are things out there in the dark places of the world that defy explanation, things that are better left alone. My encounter has left me forever changed, always looking over my shoulder, never quite able to shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The wilderness still calls to me, but now that call is tinged with dread and the memory of those footsteps in the night. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Lisa, Mike, and Alex. We'd been friends since college and tried to get together for an adventure at least once a year. This time, Jake had convinced us all to do a week-long backcountry camping trip, miles from civilization. It'll be an amazing chance to disconnect and really experience nature, he said. I was hesitant, but the enthusiasm of the others won me over. The first couple of days were actually pretty great. We hiked through stunning mountain scenery, set up camp by crystal-clear streams, and spent our evenings around the campfire sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. I was starting to understand the appeal of this whole camping thing. On the third night, everything changed. We had set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. As darkness fell, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest seemed muted, replaced by an eerie silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. We were sitting around the campfire when we heard it, a long, mournful howl in the distance. Everyone froze. "Was that a wolf?" Lisa whispered. Jake nodded slowly, his face pale in the firelight. "Yeah, but they rarely come near humans. We should be fine." But we weren't fine, not even close. Over the next hour, the howls grew closer and more frequent. We could hear rustling in the underbrush around our campsite. Occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of glowing eyes reflecting the firelight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, his voice shaking. But Jake shook his head. "It's too dangerous to try and hike out in the dark. We're safer staying put until morning." We huddled closer to the fire, weapons clutched in our hands. Jake and Mike had hunting knives, while the rest of us armed ourselves with hefty branches. The night seemed to stretch on forever, punctuated by growls and the sound of paws circling our campsite. Just before dawn, they attacked. It happened so fast. One moment we were tensely watching the tree line, and the next, a massive gray wolf burst into the clearing, followed by at least 6 others. Their eyes gleamed with a predatory light that chilled me to my core. Jake shouted for us to stick together as the pack charged. I swung my branch wildly, connecting with something solid. A wolf yelped, but another immediately took its place. Teeth snapped inches from my leg, and I screamed. The next few minutes were a blur of fur, fangs, and desperate struggle. I could hear my friends shouting and the snarls of the wolves. Something warm and wet splashed across my face. Blood, though I couldn't tell if it was human or wolf. Just when I thought we couldn't hold out any longer, Alex managed to grab a flaming branch from the fire. He swung it at the wolves, who finally backed off, yelping and whining. We seized the opportunity, grabbing what gear we could and running blindly into the forest. We ran for what felt like hours, stumbling over roots and crashing through underbrush. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. Were they still following us? I didn't dare look back to check. Finally, we couldn't run anymore. We collapsed in a small gully, gasping for breath and checking each other for injuries. By some miracle, none of us had been seriously hurt. Scratches, bruises, and minor bites, but nothing life-threatening. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of our situation sank in. We were lost in the wilderness, separated from most of our gear, and there was a pack of aggressive wolves somewhere out there. I've never felt so vulnerable and afraid in my life. We spent the rest of the day moving as quickly and quietly as we could, jumping at every sound. Jake tried to navigate us back towards civilization using the sun and his limited knowledge of the area. We had no food, no water, and night was approaching again. Just as despair was starting to set in, we heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the distant whir of helicopter blades. Somehow, search and rescue had found us. As we were lifted to safety, I looked down at the vast expanse of wilderness below. Somewhere down there, the wolf pack was still roaming. I shuddered and turned away. It's been months since that trip, and I still have nightmares about glowing eyes and snapping jaws. The sound of a dog barking is enough to send my heart racing. My friends and I don't talk much about what happened. It's like we have an unspoken agreement to try and forget. But I know I'll never really forget. That night showed me a side of nature I never wanted to see. The raw, primal ferocity that lurks just beneath the surface of our civilized world. It taught me that no matter how advanced we think we are, we're still just prey animals at heart. I haven't been camping since, and I doubt I ever will again. Some people might call me a coward, but they weren't there. They didn't feel the hot breath of a predator on their skin, or hear the bloodthirsty howls echoing through the night. They didn't experience the primal terror of being hunted. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself straining to listen, half expecting to hear a wolf's howl. And in those moments, I'm grateful for the solid walls around me and the distance between myself and the wild. Because I know now that the wilderness is not just a place of beauty and adventure. It's a realm where life and death hang in a precarious balance, and humans are not always at the top of the food chain. First day of our hike was uneventful. We trekked through dense forest, admiring the towering pines and breathing in the crisp mountain air. As evening approached, we set up camp in a small clearing and gathered around the fire, laughing and sharing stories late into the night. Little did we know that our lives were about to change forever. The next morning, we packed up our gear and set off deeper into the wilderness. About 2 hours into our hike, Jake noticed an odd smell in the air. At first, we brushed it off as some kind of wild plant, but as we continued, the scent grew stronger. It was unmistakable, marijuana. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. We veered off the main trail, following our noses through thick underbrush. Suddenly, the forest opened up into a large clearing, and our jaws dropped. Before us stood rows upon rows of marijuana plants, stretching as far as the eye could see. My heart started racing as the realization hit me. We had stumbled upon an illegal grow operation. This was no small-time setup. It was a massive professional plantation hidden deep in the wilderness. Fear gripped me as I imagined who might be behind such an operation. "We need to get out of here, now," I whispered urgently to my friends. But before we could move, we heard voices in the distance. Panic set in as we realized people were approaching. Without thinking, we dove into the thick undergrowth at the edge of the clearing, praying we wouldn't be seen. Through gaps in the foliage, I watched as 3 men entered the clearing. They were rough-looking, carrying guns and speaking in hushed tones. My blood ran cold as I realized how dangerous our situation had become. For what felt like hours, we lay motionless in the bushes, barely daring to breathe. The men moved through the plantation, inspecting plants and discussing their operation. At one point, one of them came so close to our hiding spot that I could have reached out and touched his boot. I closed my eyes, silently begging for him not to look down. As the sun began to set, the men finally left the clearing. We waited for another agonizing hour, making sure they were truly gone before we dared to move. When we finally emerged from our hiding spot, we were shaking with fear and adrenaline. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, his voice trembling. "They could come back at any moment." We grabbed our backpacks and started moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the darkening forest. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made us jump, convinced we were being followed. The terrain was rough, and in our haste, Olivia twisted her ankle. We had to slow our pace, which only added to our terror. As we stumbled through the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just a day ago now felt menacing and alive with hidden dangers. Every shadow looked like a person, every sound like approaching footsteps. After hours of frightened hiking, we finally reached our car just as dawn was breaking. We threw our gear in the trunk and sped away, not stopping until we were miles from the trailhead. Only then did we allow ourselves to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we had witnessed. We made a pact never to speak of what we had seen, fearing the consequences if the wrong people found out we had discovered their operation. It's been months since that day, but I still have nightmares about being trapped in those bushes, certain that at any moment we would be discovered. The experience has changed me. I no longer see the wilderness as a peaceful escape, but as a place where dangerous secrets can lurk just out of sight. I've tried to put it behind me, but every time I smell marijuana, I'm instantly transported back to that clearing. My heart races, and I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those armed men approaching. The incident has made me realize how naive I was about the dangers that can exist in even the most seemingly innocent places. It's a harsh reminder that the world can be a far more dangerous place than we like to believe. I still go hiking occasionally, but never far from populated areas. The thought of venturing deep into the backcountry fills me with dread. I can't help but wonder what other illegal operations might be hidden in the vast wilderness, and I have no desire to stumble upon another one. Sometimes I think about calling the authorities and reporting what we saw. But then I remember the guns those men were carrying, and the cold, hardened look in their eyes. The fear of retaliation keeps me silent. My friends and I don't talk about that day anymore. When we get together, there's always an unspoken tension, a shared secret that hangs in the air between us. Our friendship has never been quite the same since that fateful hike. I often find myself wondering about that marijuana plantation. Is it still there? Have the operators moved on, or are they continuing their illegal activities, hidden away in the mountains? The not knowing is almost as unsettling as the experience itself. This ordeal has taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of staying alert and being prepared for unexpected dangers, even in situations that seem safe. It's a reminder that sometimes curiosity can lead us into perilous situations with far-reaching consequences. As I write this, I can feel my palms sweating and my heart racing, just like they did that day in the forest. The memory is still so vivid, so terrifying. I know I'll carry this experience with me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the day a simple hiking trip turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. To anyone reading this, please be careful out there. The wilderness may seem peaceful and inviting, but it can hide dangerous secrets. Trust your instincts, stay alert, and remember that sometimes it's better to turn back than to push forward into the unknown. You never know what you might stumble upon, or who you might encounter in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. It started out as a typical morning. I woke up early in my small tent, eager to begin my observations. The air was crisp and salty, filled with the familiar cacophony of bird calls. I grabbed my binoculars and notebook and headed out to my usual spot overlooking the wetlands. At first, everything seemed normal. Flocks of sandpipers skittered along the shore, while egrets waded gracefully through the shallows. I was particularly focused on a group of endangered California least terns that had recently arrived for breeding season. But as the morning wore on, I began to notice something odd. The birds seemed agitated, restless. The terns that had been calmly preening suddenly took flight en masse, circling frantically overhead. Even the typically stoic great blue herons appeared unsettled, shifting from foot to foot and craning their long necks as if searching for something. I've seen birds react to predators before, but this was different. There was no hawk or coyote in sight, and it wasn't just one species, it was every bird in the sanctuary. The usual dawn chorus had transformed into a discordant, anxious clamor. Puzzled, I started taking rapid notes, trying to document the strange behavior. That's when I felt it, a slight tremor beneath my feet. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then it came again, stronger this time. The ground was shaking. Suddenly it clicked. The birds had sensed it before I did. An earthquake was coming. I've lived in California my whole life, so earthquakes weren't new to me. But I'd never experienced one quite like this. The shaking intensified rapidly, and I could hear a deep rumbling sound, like thunder coming from inside the earth itself. All around me, birds were taking to the sky in a panicked frenzy. The air was filled with wings and screeching calls. I stumbled to my feet, my heart racing. I knew I needed to get to open ground, away from trees or anything that could fall. But the quake was so violent, I could barely keep my balance. The earth rolled and bucked beneath me like a living thing. I fell hard, scraping my palms on the gravel path. In the distance, I heard the crack and crash of falling trees. Somehow, I managed to crawl to a clearing, curling into a ball with my arms over my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain that at any moment the ground would split open and swallow me whole. I don't know how long the shaking lasted. It felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. When it finally subsided, I cautiously opened my eyes and looked around. The landscape had been transformed. Trees were down everywhere. The path I'd been on earlier was partially collapsed, with a huge fissure running right through where I'd been standing, if I hadn't moved when I did. As the dust settled, an eerie silence fell over the sanctuary. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet, broken only by the occasional aftershock. Shaken and disoriented, I made my way back to my campsite. My tent was flattened, but miraculously my phone was still working. I called for emergency help, then sat down heavily on a fallen log, trying to process what had just happened. That's when I noticed something extraordinary. The birds were returning, but instead of the frantic chaos from before, they seemed almost purposeful. A great blue heron landed gracefully nearby, regarding me with what I could swear was a knowing look. A flock of least terns swooped overhead, their calls now sounding almost reassuring. As I watched in awe, it hit me. These birds had saved my life. Their instincts, honed over millions of years of evolution, had detected the coming quake long before any human technology could have. And in their panic, they had alerted me just in time. The next few days were a blur of emergency responders, geological surveys, and news reporters. The quake had been a significant one, 6.5 on the Richter scale, with its epicenter just offshore. There was extensive damage in nearby towns, but amazingly few casualties. Many people reported being warned by unusual animal behavior just before the quake hit. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd witnessed. I've always respected the animals I study, but this experience gave me a profound new appreciation for their abilities and their connection to the natural world. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into researching earthquake prediction and animal behavior. I learned that there have been many anecdotal reports of animals sensing impending quakes, but the phenomenon is still not well understood scientifically. Some theorize that animals can detect subtle changes in the Earth's magnetic field, or perhaps slight foreshocks imperceptible to humans. Whatever the mechanism, I knew I had witnessed something remarkable. As I wrote up my findings for scientific journals, I struggled to maintain objective, academic language. How could I convey the sheer awe I felt watching those birds sound the alarm, the bone-deep terror of the earth moving beneath me, the profound gratitude I felt towards the creatures that had saved me? In the end, I decided to write two versions, one for peer-reviewed publications and another, more personal account for a wider audience. I wanted to share not just the facts of what happened, but the emotional impact as well. How it changed my perspective on the interconnectedness of all living things. It's been several years since that day at Elkhorn Slough, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've returned to the sanctuary many times since then. On the surface, things appear back to normal. The trees have regrown, the paths repaired. But I see it with new eyes now. Every time I hear a bird call or see a flock take sudden flight, I find myself pausing, listening, not out of fear, but out of respect and wonder. They are not just subjects of study to me anymore, but teachers and protectors. I don't know if I'll ever experience anything like that earthquake again. Part of me hopes I won't. It was terrifying beyond words. But another part of me is grateful for the perspective it gave me. It was a humbling reminder of nature's power and of how much we still have to learn from the creatures we share this planet with. So now, when people ask me why I became an ornithologist, I have a new story to tell. Not just about my childhood fascination with flight, or the intellectual curiosity that drew me to study migration patterns, but about the day a chorus of birds saved my life and taught me to listen to the world around me in a whole new way. It started when I heard rumors about a supposedly haunted section of Blackwood Forest. Locals whispered about hikers going missing and strange sightings in the woods. As a skeptic, I figured it was just small-town superstition, but it piqued my curiosity enough to plan a solo camping trip to investigate and potentially write an article debunking the myths. I arrived at the trailhead on a crisp autumn morning. The forest was shrouded in mist, the tall pines looming overhead. As I shouldered my heavy pack and started down the trail, an eerie silence enveloped me. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the path. A few hours in, I set up camp in a small clearing. I spent the afternoon hiking and taking notes, but found nothing out of the ordinary. As dusk fell, I built a campfire and settled in for the night. That's when things took a turn. It started with a feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing in the gathering darkness. I tried to shake it off, but the sensation persisted. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart began to race. I told myself it must be a bear or mountain lion, but deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it around wildly, illuminating the woods. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A pair of glowing yellow eyes floating about 7 feet off the ground. They blinked once and vanished. Panic set in. I scrambled to break down my tent and pack up, hands shaking uncontrollably. Another growl, closer this time. I abandoned my gear and ran blindly into the woods, guided only by my bobbing flashlight beam. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face. The entity pursued me relentlessly. I could hear it moving through the forest, impossibly fast. Every time I looked back, I caught flashes of a dark, shadowy form flickering between the trees. My lungs burned as I sprinted deeper into the pitch-black forest. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root and I went sprawling. My flashlight flew from my hand and shattered against a rock. I was plunged into total darkness. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then a twig snapped nearby. I scrambled to my feet and pressed my back against a tree trunk, trying to stifle my gasps. That's when I saw them. 2 glowing yellow orbs, floating in the darkness about 20 feet away. They were fixed directly on me. I could make out the vague outline of a towering figure, at least 8 feet tall. It let out a bone-chilling shriek that echoed through the forest. I ran again, blind and terrified. Branches tore at my clothes and skin. I tripped and stumbled constantly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. The entity was always right behind me, letting out those awful shrieks. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My legs were ready to give out when I burst through the tree line onto a dirt road. Headlights appeared in the distance, a truck approaching. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The truck screeched to a halt, and an old man leaned out the window, asking if I was okay. I babbled incoherently about being chased. He ushered me into the passenger seat and we sped away. As we drove, I glanced in the side mirror. For a split second, I saw a towering shadow standing at the edge of the woods, yellow eyes gleaming. Then it melted back into the darkness. The old man dropped me off in town. I must have looked insane, wild-eyed, clothes torn, covered in cuts and bruises. I checked into a motel and didn't leave my room for 2 days. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the terror of that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was dehydrated and hallucinating. But I know in my heart that what I encountered was real. Something ancient and malevolent is lurking in Blackwood Forest. I abandoned my half-written article debunking the local legends. How could I possibly explain what happened? Who would believe me? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of those glowing eyes in my dreams, and the fear comes flooding back. I've given up outdoor writing. I can barely bring myself to go for a walk in the local park. The thought of entering any forest fills me with paralyzing dread. I keep expecting to see that shadowy figure materialize, coming to finish what it started. I don't know what that entity was, or why it pursued me so relentlessly. Was I simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or did I unknowingly trespass on some ancient sacred ground? The questions haunt me constantly. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces of nature that we can't explain or control. I went into those woods a skeptic and came out a believer, but that belief has come at a terrible cost. I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, heart pounding. In that hazy space between sleep and waking, I could swear I hear that bone-chilling shriek echoing in the distance. I lie there paralyzed, afraid to even breathe. My friends and family have noticed the change in me. They say I'm jumpy, paranoid. I've lost weight, and there are dark circles under my eyes from lack of sleep. I can't bring myself to tell them the truth. How could they possibly understand? I've thought about seeing a therapist, but I'm afraid they'll just dismiss it as some kind of trauma-induced hallucination. Maybe that would be easier to accept. But I know what I saw, what I felt, the sheer primordial terror of being hunted by something not of this world. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. If one day I'll look out my window and see those glowing eyes staring back at me. The rational part of my brain says I'm safe, that it can't leave the forest. But late at night, when the shadows grow long, I'm not so sure. I've done some research since that night, digging into the history and legends of Blackwood Forest. The area has a dark past, tales of native tribes that disappeared without a trace, early settlers driven mad by something in the woods. Could it be the same entity that chased me? Some kind of ancient guardian or vengeful spirit? The more I learn, the more questions I have, but I know I'll never go back to find answers. The risk is too great. I'm sharing this story as a warning. If you ever find yourself in Blackwood Forest, be on your guard. Don't dismiss the legends as mere superstition like I did. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that should be left alone. As for me, I'm trying to move on with my life, but I know I'll never be the same. That night in the forest changed me forever. I've seen behind the veil of our reality, and I can't unsee it. All I can do now is try to come to terms with the knowledge that we are not alone in this world, and that some things are better left undisturbed. I was so excited for our weekend getaway at Lake Serenity. My boyfriend Jack and I had been planning this trip for months, saving up to rent a cute little cabin right on the water. We both desperately needed a break from our stressful jobs in the city, and I couldn't wait for some peaceful relaxation surrounded by nature. As we drove up the winding road to the lake, I felt my worries start to melt away. The trees were a vibrant green, and I could see glimpses of sparkling blue water through the foliage. When we finally pulled up to our cabin, I was thrilled. It was even more charming than the pictures online, a cozy wood structure with a porch overlooking the lake. We spent that first afternoon settling in and exploring the grounds. There were only a handful of other cabins scattered around the lakeshore, mostly hidden from view. It felt wonderfully secluded and private. Jack and I took a walk along the pebbly beach, hand in hand, breathing in the fresh pine-scented air. The water lapped gently at the shore and birds chirped in the trees. It was so tranquil. As the sun began to set, we headed back to make dinner. Jack grilled some steaks on the porch while I prepared a salad inside. We ate on the porch, watching the sky turn stunning shades of pink and orange. I felt so content and at peace. After dinner, we decided to sit out on the dock and do some stargazing. The night was clear and cool, perfect for cuddling up together with a blanket. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, more and more stars became visible. I'd never seen so many in my life. It was breathtaking. We pointed out constellations to each other and saw several shooting stars. It was incredibly romantic. Around midnight, we reluctantly headed inside to go to bed. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when I jolted awake. At first I was disoriented, not remembering where I was. Then I heard it again, the sound that must have woken me. A loud splash, followed by frantic splashing noises. "Jack," I whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He sat up groggily. "Hear what?" "Listen," I said. We both fell silent. For a few moments, all I could hear was the sound of our breathing. Then it came again, desperate splashing sounds, and what sounded like a strangled cry for help. Jack leapt out of bed. "Someone's in trouble," he said, grabbing a flashlight. I followed him outside, heart pounding. The sound seemed to be coming from the far end of our dock. We ran down to the water's edge, scanning the dark lake with the flashlight beam. "Hello?" Jack called out. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" More splashing, more frantic now. The beam of light caught something, an arm flailing above the surface about 30 feet from shore. Without hesitation, Jack dove into the water and started swimming towards the struggling figure. I stood frozen on the dock, torn between jumping in to help and staying put in case I needed to call for more assistance. "I'm coming," Jack yelled. "Hold on." He was almost to the spot where we'd seen the arm, but now I couldn't see any sign of the person. The water had gone still. "Where are you?" Jack called, treading water and looking around frantically. "Can you hear me?" Silence. Jack dove under, searching. He came up sputtering. "I can't find them," he yelled to me, panic in his voice. "Keep looking," I shouted back. I ran to grab my phone to call 911. For the next hour, Jack swam around searching while I paced the shoreline calling out. But there was no sign of the person we'd heard. When the local police and rescue team arrived, they launched boats and used sonar equipment to scan the lake bottom. They searched all night, but found nothing. No body, no evidence that anyone had been in distress. The police were baffled. They took our statements but seemed skeptical of our story. I could tell they thought we might have been drunk or hallucinating. But I know what I heard and saw. Someone had been out there, desperately fighting for their life, and then they had simply vanished. Jack and I barely slept for the rest of the night. We sat huddled together on the porch, staring out at the now calm water, unable to process what had happened. As the sun rose, painting the lake in soft pinks and golds, it all felt surreal. How could such a peaceful place have been the scene of such horror just hours before? We decided to cut our trip short and head home that morning. I couldn't bear to look at the lake anymore. Its beauty now felt like a sinister mask hiding dark secrets. As we drove away, I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if there was something more we could have done. The image of that arm reaching desperately out of the water was seared into my brain. It's been weeks now, but I still have nightmares about that night. I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing phantom splashing sounds. Jack and I have talked about it endlessly, trying to make sense of what happened. But we have no answers, only lingering fear and guilt. I've done some research on Lake Serenity since we got back. At first I found nothing unusual in its history. But then I came across an old newspaper article from the 1950s describing a similar incident. A couple on a camping trip who heard cries for help in the night, only to find no trace of the person when they tried to help. It sent chills down my spine. I can't help but feel the lake is hiding something sinister beneath its placid surface. Some malevolent force that lures people to their doom. I know it sounds crazy, but after what we experienced, I can't shake the feeling that supernatural forces were at work that night. Jack thinks I'm becoming obsessed and wants me to see a therapist to process the trauma. Maybe he's right, but I can't let it go. I need answers. Part of me wants to go back to Lake Serenity to investigate further, but a larger part is terrified to ever set foot near that water again. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully enjoy lakes or swimming again. That sense of peace and serenity I felt when we first arrived now feels like a distant memory. Our romantic getaway turned into a nightmare that continues to haunt us. I just hope that by sharing this story, I can warn others to be careful. You never know what dangers may be lurking beneath the surface of even the most beautiful places. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day wilderness course. I had a group of 8 students, mostly city folks looking to learn some basic outdoor skills. We'd hiked about 10 miles into a remote area of national forest, far from any trails or campsites. I wanted to give them a taste of true wilderness, if only I'd known what was waiting for us out there. The first day and a half went smoothly. We set up camp, practiced fire-starting techniques, learned how to purify water. Pretty standard stuff. It was on the afternoon of the second day that everything went to hell. I'd taken the group on a hike to practice navigation skills when we came across a small opening in a rocky hillside. It looked like the entrance to a cave, mostly hidden by thick underbrush. My curiosity got the better of me. I figured it would be a good opportunity to teach the group about natural shelters, so I decided we'd check it out. As we approached the cave entrance, I felt an immediate sense of unease. There was just something off about it. The air felt colder, damper. An eerie silence seemed to emanate from the darkness beyond. I should have listened to my instincts and turned back right then. But I didn't want to seem paranoid in front of my students, so I pressed on. I pulled out my flashlight and took a few steps inside, motioning for the others to follow. The beam of light revealed a narrow passageway that quickly opened up into a larger chamber. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I froze in horror at what I saw scattered across the cave floor. Bones, human bones. They were everywhere. Femurs, ribs, fragments of skulls. Some looked old and weathered, while others seemed disturbingly fresh. My mind reeled as I tried to process what I was seeing. Who did these belong to? How did they get here? One of my students, a young woman named Emily, let out a terrified gasp behind me. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is this place?" I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there immediately. But as I turned to usher the group back outside, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. There were crude drawings on the cave walls, stick figures and strange symbols smeared in what looked horribly like dried blood. And carved into the rock face were dozens of tally marks, as if someone had been keeping count of something. A primal fear gripped me as I realized we were standing in someone's, or something's, lair. "Everyone out. Now," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. We had barely taken 2 steps when an inhuman shriek echoed through the cave. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a guttural, feral sound that chilled me to my core. And it was coming from deeper in the cave. Panic set in as we all scrambled for the exit. But we weren't fast enough. A figure burst from the shadows, moving with terrifying speed. In the chaos and darkness, I could only catch glimpses: matted hair, wild eyes, skin covered in dirt and blood. It was a man, or at least it had been once. Now it was something else entirely, feral, savage, barely human. He lunged at us, howling and snapping his teeth. I yelled at my students to run as I put myself between them and the creature. It slammed into me with shocking force, knocking me to the ground. I felt its hot, putrid breath on my face as razor-sharp nails raked across my chest. Somehow, I managed to kick it off me and scramble to my feet. I bolted for the cave entrance, my heart pounding in my ears. I emerged into the fading daylight to find my students in a panic, screaming and crying. "Run!" I shouted. "Back to camp now!" We took off through the forest, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. I could hear it behind us, branches snapping, that terrible shrieking growing closer. How could it move so fast through such dense forest? Emily tripped and fell with a cry of pain. I rushed back to help her up, terrified of what I'd see closing in behind us. But there was nothing there. The forest had gone eerily quiet. We made it back to our campsite, breathless and terrified. I quickly got everyone to pack up their gear. There was no way we were spending another night out here. We hiked out in the fading light, not stopping until we reached the trailhead hours later. The authorities didn't believe us when we reported what happened. They searched the area and found no trace of the cave or its horrifying inhabitant. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but then I look at the scars on my chest, from where that thing's nails raked across my skin, and I know it was real. I don't lead wilderness courses anymore. I can't bring myself to go back into those remote forests, because now I know what's out there, lurking in the darkness. And I know that some places in this world are best left unexplored. I still have nightmares about that day. The bones scattered across the cave floor, the inhuman shriek echoing through the darkness, those wild feral eyes as it lunged at me. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that terrible howling in the distance. I've tried to research similar incidents in that area, but I've found nothing concrete. Just vague rumors and campfire stories about people going missing in those woods. Part of me wants to go back, to try and find answers. But a bigger part knows that would be suicide. Whatever that thing in the cave was, it wasn't natural. It was something ancient and evil that should have stayed buried in the dark. And I'm terrified that one day it might find its way out of those remote forests and into the wider world. So I'm sharing this story as a warning. Be careful out there in the wilderness. Stick to the marked trails and campgrounds. And if you ever come across a hidden cave in the middle of nowhere, for the love of God, don't go inside. Some secrets are best left undiscovered. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened that day. The physical scars have mostly healed, but the mental ones run deep. I used to feel at home in the wilderness, but now every rustle of leaves or snapping twig fills me with dread. Sometimes I wonder about that thing in the cave. Was it truly alone, or are there more of its kind out there? How long had it been living in that cave, and what twisted evolution had turned it into the monster we encountered? I've entertained all sorts of theories, everything from an undiscovered hominid species to some government experiment gone wrong. But in the end, I don't think I want to know the truth. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. All I know is that I'll never forget the primal terror I felt in that moment, the bone-deep certainty that I was face to face with something that defied explanation. It was a stark reminder that for all our technology and supposed mastery over nature, we're still just fragile creatures in a world full of dangers we can't comprehend. So if you're reading this and planning a wilderness trip of your own, please be careful out there. Respect nature, but never forget that it can be brutal and unforgiving. And always remember that some of the darkest, most terrifying things in this world are the ones we haven't discovered yet. As for me, I'm done with the deep wilderness. These days, I stick to short day hikes in well-traveled areas. It's not the same rush as true backcountry exploration, but at least I can sleep at night without worrying about what might be lurking in the shadows. I hope sharing this story helps someone avoid a similar fate. And if you ever find yourself deep in the wilderness and stumble upon a hidden cave, just turn around and walk away. Trust me, whatever's inside isn't worth the risk. The first day of my hike was uneventful. I made good time on the trail, enjoying the crisp mountain air and breathtaking views. As evening approached, I found a nice spot to set up camp near a babbling stream. I fell asleep that night feeling peaceful and content, excited for the days ahead. The next morning, I woke up early, broke camp, and hit the trail again. My plan was to hike deeper into the backcountry, far from any roads or civilization. Around midday, I veered off the main trail to explore a secluded valley I had read about online. That's when things took a terrifying turn. As I hiked through a particularly dense section of forest, I started to get an eerie feeling, like I was being watched. The birds had gone quiet, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air. My instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right. I paused and scanned my surroundings, straining to hear any unusual sounds. That's when I saw it, a wisp of smoke rising above the trees about a quarter-mile ahead. My first thought was that it must be another hiker's campfire. But then I remembered how remote this area was supposed to be. Very few people ventured this far into the wilderness. A sense of dread began to creep over me. I knew I should turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept forward to investigate. As I got closer, I could make out voices, gruff male voices that didn't sound like friendly campers. My heart started racing as I realized I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. Crouching behind a fallen log, I peered through the foliage and saw a clearing with several tents and a campfire. There were 5 men, all rough-looking and armed with rifles. My blood ran cold as I realized these must be criminals hiding out in the wilderness. Maybe bank robbers or drug smugglers. Whatever they were, I knew I was in serious danger if they spotted me. I started to slowly back away, but in my nervousness, I accidentally snapped a twig underfoot. The sharp crack seemed to echo through the forest. Instantly, all 5 men were on alert, grabbing their weapons and scanning the trees. I froze in terror, hardly daring to breathe. "Who's there?" one of them shouted. "Come out now, or we start shooting." Panic overtook me, and I sprinted away as fast as I could. I heard angry shouts, and then gunshots rang out, splintering tree bark around me. Adrenaline surged through my body as I ran for my life, crashing through the underbrush. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my face, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between me and those men. I could hear them crashing through the woods behind me, getting closer. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer terror kept me going. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15-20 minutes, I couldn't run anymore. I dove behind a large boulder, gasping for air. I could still hear the men searching, but their voices sounded farther away now. Had I managed to lose them? As I tried to calm my ragged breathing, I assessed my situation. I had dropped my backpack while fleeing, so I had no supplies, no map, no water. I was hopelessly lost in a vast wilderness with armed criminals hunting me. Panic threatened to overwhelm me again, but I forced myself to think clearly. I needed a plan. I decided my best bet was to find a hiding spot and wait until dark, then try to make my way back to the main trail under cover of night. Moving as silently as I could, I found a dense thicket and burrowed deep inside, pulling branches around to conceal myself. Then I waited, my nerves on edge, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. The afternoon dragged on endlessly. Several times I heard the men's voices in the distance, still searching. As dusk fell, it got eerily quiet. Had they given up? I didn't dare move to check. When it was finally fully dark, I cautiously emerged from my hiding spot. The forest was pitch black and I had no flashlight. I picked a direction that I hoped would lead back to the trail and started walking, using the stars to navigate. Every step was terrifying. I kept imagining armed men lurking behind every tree. Twice I heard noises that sent me diving for cover, but it turned out to be just animals. After hours of stumbling through the darkness, my feet bleeding and my body aching, I miraculously found the trail again. I wanted to cry with relief, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I still had miles to go before reaching my car. I pushed on through the night, jumping at shadows, certain that at any moment I would hear angry voices or gunshots behind me. It was nearing dawn when I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car. I've never been so happy to see a beat-up old Subaru in my life. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. Only then did I break down, the full impact of what I'd been through hitting me all at once. I reported what happened to the police, but since I couldn't pinpoint the exact location, there wasn't much they could do. They did send a team to search the area, but found no trace of the camp. To this day, I don't know who those men were or what they were doing out there. That experience changed me. I used to see the wilderness as a peaceful refuge, but now I know it can hide real dangers. I still go hiking, but never alone anymore. And I'm much more cautious about venturing off established trails. Sometimes I still have nightmares about being chased through dark forests. The terror felt so real, so immediate. It was like being in a horror movie, except it was actually happening to me. I'll never forget the sound of those gunshots or the murderous fury in the men's voices as they hunted me. I know I'm incredibly lucky to have escaped. If they had caught me, I have no doubt they would have killed me to keep their hideout secret. It's chilling to think how close I came to disappearing forever in those remote woods, my fate unknown. So let my experience be a warning. You never know what you might encounter in the wilderness. Be prepared, be alert, and trust your instincts if something feels off. Nature's beauty can hide real dangers. I learned that lesson the hard way, and it's one I'll never forget. I was an avid hiker, always seeking out new trails and hidden gems in nature. That's what led me to Blackwater State Park one crisp autumn day. I'd heard rumors of some lesser-known paths deep in the woods, off the main trails. The kind of places only locals knew about. I was eager to explore and maybe find something special. The day started off perfectly. Clear skies, a light breeze rustling the colorful leaves. I set off early, my backpack loaded with supplies for a full day of hiking. For the first few hours, I stuck to the marked trails, enjoying the scenery but itching to venture further. Around midday, I spotted a faint path branching off into denser forest. This was exactly what I'd been looking for. I followed the overgrown trail, pushing through thick underbrush. The woods grew darker and quieter the further I went. After about an hour of tough hiking, the path opened up into a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The trees surrounding the clearing were wrong. Their bark was twisted into unnatural shapes, forming intricate patterns and symbols I'd never seen before. They almost looked like some kind of ancient writing system, but far more complex and alien. I approached one of the trees, running my hand over the strange markings. The bark felt unnaturally smooth, as if it had been polished. That's when I noticed the objects scattered on the ground. At first glance, they looked like oddly shaped rocks or pieces of wood. But as I picked one up, I realized it was something else entirely. It was lightweight, almost metallic, covered in the same bizarre symbols as the trees. I couldn't begin to guess what it was made of, or what purpose it served. A chill ran down my spine as I surveyed the clearing. How had no one discovered this place before? The symbols and artifacts clearly weren't natural, but they also didn't look like anything made by modern humans. It was as if I'd stumbled upon the remnants of some long-lost civilization. I spent the next few hours documenting everything I could. I took dozens of photos, made rubbings of the tree symbols, and collected a few of the smaller artifacts to examine later. My mind was racing with questions. Who created all this? How old was it? What did the symbols mean? I was so engrossed in my discoveries that I barely noticed the sun starting to set. As darkness fell, the atmosphere in the clearing changed dramatically. The symbols on the trees seemed to shimmer in the fading light, almost as if they were moving. A sense of unease crept over me. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the edge of the clearing. I spun around, heart pounding, but couldn't see anything in the growing darkness. The growl came again, closer this time. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking. As I swept the beam of light across the tree line, I caught a glimpse of something. It was only for a split second, but what I saw defied explanation. A tall, shadowy figure, its form constantly shifting and changing. It didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. Panic set in. I stuffed my camera and the artifacts into my backpack and bolted for the path I'd come in on. As I ran, crashing through the underbrush, I could hear something massive moving through the forest behind me. The growling had turned into a high-pitched, inhuman shriek that made my blood run cold. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The presence behind me felt oppressive, as if the very air was growing thick and heavy. I didn't dare look back, focused only on putting as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. After what felt like hours of running, I finally burst out onto one of the main park trails. The normal sounds of the forest returned, crickets chirping, a distant owl hooting. Whatever had been chasing me seemed to have given up once I left the deep woods. I made it back to my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away from the park, my mind was reeling. What had I stumbled upon? What was that thing in the woods? In the days that followed, I pored over the photos I'd taken and examined the artifacts I'd brought back. But the more I looked, the less sense it all made. The symbols defied any attempt at translation or categorization. The artifacts seemed to be made of some unknown material that didn't match anything in scientific databases. I considered reporting my discovery to the park rangers or local authorities, but every time I tried to tell the story, the words wouldn't come. It was as if some part of me knew that what I'd experienced wasn't meant for others to know about. That day in the woods changed me profoundly. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. I've given up hiking altogether. The thought of going back into the forest fills me with paralyzing dread. Sometimes at night, I swear I can hear that inhuman shriek in the distance, calling me back to that clearing. I don't know what ancient secret I uncovered that day, or what forces I might have awakened. All I know is that there are things in this world far beyond our understanding, hidden just out of sight. And sometimes, it's better to leave those secrets buried. The day started off perfectly. We hiked several miles into a secluded area of the forest, enjoying the crisp autumn air and vibrant fall colors. The kids were in high spirits as we set up camp, joking around as they pitched tents and gathered firewood. That evening, we roasted marshmallows and told spooky stories around the campfire. It was exactly the kind of wholesome outdoor experience I'd hoped to create. As the fire died down and we prepared for bed, I did a head count to make sure everyone was accounted for. That's when I realized Emily was missing. At first, I assumed she'd just wandered off to use the bathroom, but after 15 minutes passed with no sign of her, I started to worry. I gathered the other campers, and we began calling her name, shining our flashlights through the trees. "Emily, Emily, where are you?" Our voices echoed through the dark forest, but there was no response. The other kids were getting scared now too. What if she got lost? What if a bear got her? 14-year-old Zach asked, his voice shaking. I tried to stay calm and reassuring, but inside I was panicking. How could I have let one of my campers disappear on my watch? We expanded our search, fanning out in different directions while staying within shouting distance of each other. The shadows seemed to come alive in the glare of our flashlights, every rustle of leaves making us jump. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, Megan's scream pierced the night. We all rushed toward the sound to find her pointing shakily at something on the ground. It was a torn piece of fabric, unmistakably from Emily's red flannel shirt, and it was stained with what looked horribly like blood. My stomach dropped as I knelt to examine it. "Oh God," I whispered. This was so much worse than I'd feared. Had Emily been attacked by an animal? Kidnapped by some deranged person lurking in the woods? My mind raced with horrible possibilities. The other campers were in various states of panic now. Some were crying, others looked ready to bolt. I knew I had to keep it together for their sake, but I was terrified. We were miles from any help, with no cell service. I had no idea what to do next. Just then, we heard a twig snap nearby. We all whirled around, our flashlights illuminating a figure standing just beyond the tree line. For a split second, I felt a surge